The blood law was absolute, and Magnus Dunraven had exactly 3 days to obey it, or watch his entire court burn. Marina Davenport stood in the center of the most terrifying room she had ever entered in her 28 years of life, and she was not trembling. She had made a decision to stop trembling approximately 6 weeks ago. Somewhere around the third time, she had been escorted through hidden corridors beneath London by pale-skinned guards with silver eyes, and she had held to that decision with everything she had. The grand chamber of the Dunraven court stretched 60 feet above her head. Its vaulted ceilings carved from black stone that caught the amber light of 1,000 candles, and threw the shadows of ancient banners across the marble floor. At the far end of the chamber, on a throne that looked as though it had been cut directly from obsidian, sat Magnus Dunraven, Duke of the Nocturne Court, elder of the First Houses, and the single most dangerous individual Marina had ever loved. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her when he was afraid for her, which was to say, he was looking at her with an expression carved from cold fury and absolute control. His silver-white hair swept back from a face, so perfectly pale it might have been sculpted from the same stone as his throne. His eyes, a deep and burning crimson, were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. He was not the one who had summoned her here tonight. That was the problem. On either side of the throne chamber, ranked in ascending tiers like a Gothic amphitheatre, stood the representatives of the 12 nocturne houses, every one of them ancient, every one of them powerful, and most of them currently staring at Marina, with expressions ranging from contempt to cold calculation. These were vampires who had watched civilizations rise and collapse. They wore modern suits and elegant gowns because they had learned to blend across centuries. But there was nothing modern about the hunger in their eyes. The one who had summoned her was Valdric Ashencroft, eldest of the second house, a vampire who made Magnus look young by comparison, which was staggering given that Magnus had been alive since the 12th century. Valdric stood at the center of the chamber floor, flanked by 2 vampires, with expressions like drawn blades, and his voice when he spoke was smooth in the way that broken glass is smooth when you cannot yet see the edges. "The blood law of succession is clear," Valdric said, his accent layered with centuries she could not identify. "The Duke of the Nocturne Court must secure a line of succession within the 40th year of his current ascension period. That period ends in 3 days. An heir must be declared, or the dukedom reverts by ancient vow to the collective governance of the 12 houses." He paused, letting that land. "We are simply here to ensure the Duke understands his options." Marina understood, without anyone needing to spell it out, that what Valdric called options and what Magnus called options were very different things. She had been teaching at Blackthorn Academy for 3 years before any of this had begun. She had been a perfectly ordinary literature and ethics teacher with a stubborn habit of reading past midnight and an extraordinary ability to hold her ground when 14-year-olds tried to argue that turning in essays 3 weeks late was philosophically defensible. She had discovered the existence of vampires in the most undramatic way possible, which was that one of her students had been bleeding in an alley behind the school, and the being that had stopped to help was not human, and had not thought to hide it in the urgency of the moment. The being had been Magnus Dunraven, which meant the moment the secret was out, it was out in the most significant way it could possibly be out. That had been 8 months ago, and in those 8 months, Marina had learned more about the hidden world beneath the visible one than she had ever imagined existed. She had also, against every rational argument she had made to herself, fallen profoundly in love with a vampire duke who looked at her like she was the most bewildering and precious thing he had encountered in 900 years of existence. Now Valdric Ashencroft was laying a trap for both of them, and Marina could see every edge of it. "The Duke," Valdric continued, his eyes sliding toward Marina with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl, "has been observed spending considerable time with a human female, a teacher." The word carried exactly the contempt he intended it to. Under normal circumstances, a human consort would be dismissed as irrelevant. However, given the succession crisis, several of the houses have proposed a solution that falls within the ancient legal frameworks. Magnus rose from his throne. He did not move quickly or visibly. He simply went from seated to standing in the way that very old, Very powerful things move, which is to say, without any of the telegraphed preparation that human movement requires, and when he stood, every single representative in the chamber went still. "Choose your next words with exceptional care, Ashencroft," Magnus said, and his voice was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, the kind of quiet that exists because everything beneath it is moving with enormous force. Valdric, to his credit, did not flinch. He had been alive too long to flinch. The law permits a human consort to be converted and bound by blood oath within the succession period, thereby establishing the Duke's line through the bonded consort system. Alternatively, the human may be released from court knowledge, and the Duke may select a proper vampire heir from among the second house's candidates. He smiled, and it was not a warm expression. We are, of course, prepared to be generous in the matter of the selection. There it was, the forced choice. Magnus converts Marina without her full and free consent, which would violate everything he had ever told Marina. Marina, he believed, about the ancient code of honor that governed what little decency existed in the vampire world, or he releases her from the court's knowledge, which in the language of the Nocturne Court meant that she would be made to forget every single thing she knew, every moment she had spent with him, every truth he had trusted her with, and his court would be handed to Valdric's preferred candidates. Marina looked at Magnus across the long, cold expanse of the chamber floor, and she saw something she had only seen once before on his face, in a much quieter moment, in his private library, when he had told her the truth about what he was, before he had known she already knew. She saw fear. Not for himself. Magnus Dunraven was not afraid of anything that touched himself. He was afraid for her, and the weight of that terror lived behind his controlled expression like fire behind a marble wall. She turned to face Valdric Ashencroft, and she straightened her spine to the exact posture she used when she was about to explain to a room full of resistant students that the assigned reading was not optional. "You have presented those as the only two options," she said. "They are not." The chamber went very quiet. Valdric raised one pale eyebrow. "Forgive me. I was not aware the human female had been granted speaking rights in the succession proceeding." "You called me here," Marina said evenly. "That was your first tactical mistake. I am not a variable to be managed. I am a party to the situation you have constructed, which means I am standing to address it. The blood law of succession requires the Duke to secure a line, not to convert a specific individual or surrender his court. Those are your interpretations, not the law itself." She had spent the last 3 weeks reading every document Magnus had been able to provide her on the ancient legal codes, because she was a teacher, and when she needed to understand something, she read until the understanding was no longer optional. The bonded consort system you referenced is voluntary in its original framing. The conversion must be freely chosen by both parties, and the candidate heir system you are proposing requires the Duke's endorsement, which he has not given. Valdric stared at her for a long moment. Around the chamber, the representatives of the 12 houses were very still. "You have been coaching her," Valdric said to Magnus, and now his voice had lost some of its smoothness. "I have been talking to her," Magnus said, moving forward from the throne dais with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who has all the time in the universe and intends to use it precisely because she is worth talking to, Ashencroft. Because she is worth every consideration that you have, in your extraordinary arrogance, decided to withhold from her. He reached the center of the floor and stopped beside Marina, not in front of her, not behind her, but precisely beside her, and the symbolism of that positioning was not lost on the assembled court. "She has given you the correct legal reading. I have also had my own counsel review the succession texts. The 3-day window requires a declaration of intent, not a completed conversion or a ratified candidate. We have options that you have deliberately omitted from your presentation." Valdric's eyes narrowed. "The declaration of intent is a technicality. The full binding must be completed within 60 days of the declaration," Magnus said, "which gives us time to pursue this correctly, on our terms." The trap had not sprung the way Valdric had intended. Marina could feel the shift in the room, the subtle recalculation happening behind dozens of immortal eyes, and she also felt, very precisely, the moment Magnus's hand found hers in the space between them, his fingers closing around her knuckles with a grip that was as controlled as everything else about him, and communicated, in the pressure of his cold hand, everything he would not say in front of the court. They got out of the chamber intact. That was the beginning. The halls of the Dunraven court beneath London were a marvel that Marina had never quite stopped marveling at, despite her resolution to be unflappable. The court existed in a series of vast carved spaces beneath the oldest district of the city, accessible through 12 different concealed entrances and lit entirely by enchanted amber light that had been a gift from the Eastern courts centuries ago. The architecture was a layering of every era Magnus had inhabited, medieval vaulting against Victorian ironwork against something older and more brutal underneath it all, and walking through it with Magnus was always the sensation of moving through living history. He walked quickly now, his hand still at the small of her back, as they moved through the private corridor behind the grand chamber. And he did not speak until the door was sealed behind them, and the guard had taken his post at a respectful distance. Then Magnus turned to face her, and the controlled fury she had seen on in the chamber had not dissipated. It had only been redirected. "You should not have been in that room," he said. "Valdric summoned me there." "Valdric should not have been able to summon you anywhere. I had specific protocols in place to Magnus." She said his name the way she said things she wanted him to actually hear, flat and clear and, without the formality that everyone else in his world wrapped around every syllable they directed at him. "Someone in your own court told Valdric where to find me and how to reach me." The protocols failed because they were compromised from inside. He went still in that particular way of his that was not human stillness. It was the absolute cessation of the small reflexive movements that living things made without noticing, and she knew from 8 months of watching him that this was what Magnus Dunraven looked like when he was thinking at full capacity. It was, despite everything, one of the most striking things about him. "Corvain," he said, after a moment that stretched. "Third House liaison. He has been angling for a position in the Ashencroft faction for 2 years. Can you prove it?" "I can determine it," Magnus said, which was a different answer. Marina moved to the carved stone bench against the corridor wall and sat down, because her legs were willing to stop pretending they had not been carrying the weight of that chamber encounter for the last 40 minutes. She pressed her palms together between her knees and breathed. Magnus crossed to her in 3 steps and crouched in front of her, his crimson eyes level with hers, his expression doing the thing it only did when they were alone, which was to say it did something real. The regal stone smoothed into something that was still powerful, but also present in a way that public Magnus was not, his gaze meeting hers with a directness that always felt, absurdly, like being seen. "I will not allow them to harm you," he said. "I know." She did know. She had seen what Magnus Dunraven was willing to do when the people under his protection were threatened, and it was considerable. "But you can't protect me from every angle of this simultaneously. Valdric has a plan. Tonight was only the first move, then we will respond to the second move when it arrives." "No," Marina shook her head. "We respond now, before it arrives. We make the declaration." Magda's expression changed in a way she could not quite name. "Marina, I have read every document you gave me, and several you did not, because your archivist, Seraphine, is extraordinarily helpful when someone asks her the right questions. I understand what the declaration means. I understand what the 60 days means." She held his gaze. "I also understand what it means if Valdric gains control of this court. How many humans are we talking about, Magnus? How many people in this city live in proximity to your court's protection without knowing they have it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Several thousand families in the older districts. The arrangement dates to the 19th century. The court enforces a non-predation zone and mediates any supernatural incursions in exchange for the silence of the communities that discovered us over the centuries. And if Valdric's faction takes control," his jaw tightened, "Ashencroft holds a different philosophy regarding human populations." I gathered. Marina stood up, and because he was still crouching, she was briefly, absurdly taller than him, which lasted approximately half a second before he rose, with that effortless, fluid grace. "So this is not only about us. This is about thousands of people who are safer because you run this court, and who become dramatically less safe if you don't. I am aware of that. Then we make the declaration. We buy the 60 days, and in 60 days we figure out the rest." Magnus looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the layered complexity of everything he was not saying. The 900 years of things he had learned not to want, because wanting them too loudly led to the kind of loss that an immortal carried forward forever. And she could also see the thing that lived underneath all of that, which she had first noticed approximately 4 months ago, and had been trying to name ever since. "You are the most extraordinary individual I have met in 9 centuries, he said finally. "And I am not certain whether that is the most compelling argument for the declaration or the most devastating argument against it. Because if we make the declaration, and then something happens to me in 60 days, Marina said, you will have invested more than you intended to." He did not deny it. "Magnus," she said his name again, softer this time. "Something is already happening. It started the night in the alley, and it has not stopped since. And I think we are both aware of that, and have been declining to discuss it, because the logistics are complicated and terrifying, and I grade papers and you run a vampire court, and none of this makes any narrative sense." She paused. "But here we are." He reached out and touched her face with one hand, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a precision that suggested he was committing the geography of her to a memory that would last for centuries. And the cold of his touch, which had startled her the first time, and now felt like the most natural thing in the world, moved through her like a quiet tide. "Here we are," he agreed. The declaration was made the following morning. Registered before a tribunal of the 3 eldest neutral house representatives, and recorded in the Nocturne Court's oldest bound record, the Codex of Intentions, which had been maintained continuously since the 13th century, and smelled accordingly. Magnus spoke the formal words in Old French, because the succession law had been codified in that era, and Marina stood beside him in the most composed clothing she owned, which was a dark green dress she had worn to a faculty dinner the previous winter. And she thought about how thoroughly her life had changed, and decided that she was all right with that. Valdric Ashencroft was present, as he was legally required to be, and his expression as he witnessed the declaration was the expression of someone recalculating at speed. The trap had been avoided, but the war had not ended. Marina understood this. She had also, in the hour before the declaration, written down every concern and considered argument she could generate about what she was doing, because she was a teacher and she believed in examining things honestly, and when she had finished the list, she had looked at it for a long time, and then looked at Magnus across the room, where he was reviewing succession documents with his counsel. The precise line of his profile and the particular stillness of his concentration, and the way he glanced up at her, as though he had known she was watching, without turning to look. And she had folded the list and placed it in her coat pocket, where it had stayed through the proceeding. After the declaration, they were given a private hour by court protocol, and Magnus took her to his library, which was the room in the court that she loved most unreservedly. 3 stories of shelved books rising around a central reading space with leather chairs worn soft by centuries of use. Amber light moving across the spines of things that no public collection held. He poured her tea. He had stocked tea in his library 3 weeks into their acquaintance without comment, and it had been sitting there ever since. She wrapped her hands around the cup and watched him move to the window, which was above ground level and fitted with specialized glass that filtered sunlight into something that did not ignite him. The light caught the silver white of his hair and made him look exactly like what he was, which was something ancient and beautiful and not entirely safe. "Tell me about the Heir question," Marina said. "The actual question, not the legal framing." He turned from the window. "What do you mean?" "The blood law exists because courts need continuity. I understand the political argument. What I don't understand is the personal one. You have had 900 years to address this, and you haven't. Why?" Magnus was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. He came to the chair across from her and sat, folding his long frame into it with the elegant economy of movement that was characteristic, and he looked at her with an expression that had something old and tired in it, underneath the regal composure. "I was married once," he said. "In the 16th century, she was vampire-born, a daughter of the 5th house. Her name was Isidora. She was brilliant and ferocious and very alive, even by immortal standards." He paused. She was killed in the court wars of 1587, a conflict that I was leading. A decision I made resulted in her being in a location she would not otherwise have been, and she did not survive it. Marina said nothing and waited, because she had learned that with Magnus, silence was not emptiness, it was space. I have not permitted myself to build what I built with her since then, because the court is always dangerous and the decisions of leadership always carry consequence, and I had learned the cost. He met her eyes. And then you were in an alley behind a school at 11 o'clock at night, telling a dazed student to keep pressure on a wound, with a calm that suggested you considered this sort of emergency entirely manageable, and you looked up at me and said, "I assume you are not going to hurt him, or you would not have stopped." And I thought that was possibly the most precisely observed thing anyone had said in my presence in 400 years. Marina felt something warm and complicated move through her chest, and that was a problem. It became one progressively, Magnus agreed, and there was something very close to dry humor in his voice, which was one of the things she loved about him, that underneath the weight of centuries he retained the capacity for a rueful kind of wit. "Magnus," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something that I have been not asking for 2 months. Then ask it, the conversion, the process of it. What does it actually mean for me? Not the political version, the real version." He held her gaze steadily. "You would not die, the human you are would not die in the way that humans fear death. What you are, your consciousness, your memory, yourself, would persist, but you would be changed. You would be what I am. You would have the needs I have, the constraints I have. You would not age. People you know now would grow old and eventually be gone. You would outlast everything you currently know by an enormous margin." He paused. "It is not something I would ever ask of you. I want to say that clearly. What I told the court yesterday about the declaration being freely chosen is what I believe, not what I said because it served us legally." "I know," Marina said. "That is why I trusted it." "What I hope," he said, and his voice changed on the word hope in a way that suggested it was not one he used off-on or easily, "is that 60 days allows us to find an alternative legal path within the succession framework. My counsel believes there may be an interpretation of the bonded consort provision that does not require conversion. A human consort who is formally bound by court record and publicly declared may satisfy the lineage requirement under a different reading of the original text. It has never been tested, but the argument is sound." Marina set down her teacup. "You have been trying to find a solution that does not require me to choose between being human and being with you." "Yes. For how long?" "Since the 3rd week of our acquaintance, when I realized the situation had become relevant." She stared at him. "That was 6 months ago, Magnus, I am aware. And you did not tell me. I did not want to alarm you before I knew whether the problem was solvable, and I did not want to." He stopped. "You did not want to presume." Marina finished for him. "I did not want to presume," he agreed quietly. She stood up from her chair and crossed the small space between them and sat on the arm of his chair, which was not a conventional choice, but she was a teacher who had sat on desks for her entire professional career, and the habit was entrenched, and she looked down at him, and he looked up at her, and the spatial reversal of their usual dynamic seemed to do something, some small and specific something, to his expression. "Magnus Dunraven," she said, "I need you to stop trying to protect me from information that is about me. That is a reasonable request," he said. "And I need you to understand that I am not Isadora. I am not going to be put in a position because of a decision you make that puts me at risk, because I am going to be in the room making the decisions with you. That is not negotiable." Something shifted in his face that she could only describe as the settling of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. "That," he said, "is the most terrifying and comforting thing anyone has said to me in 4 centuries. I am a teacher," Marina said. "I am comfortable with both things simultaneously." She did not expect him to reach up and take her hand from where it rested on the chair back, or to bring it to his lips with a formality that was so genuinely meant it bypassed all her careful emotional management entirely and landed somewhere she was not defended against. But he did, and it did. And she decided that this was information she would process later, and for now simply allowed herself to be in the moment that was happening. The second move came 3 nights later, and it was considerably less elegant than the first. Marina was at Blackthorn Academy because she had not stopped teaching. She had made this very firmly to Magnus, who had made his position on the matter equally clear, and they had reached an arrangement where two members of his personal guard maintained proximity to the school building during her working hours in forms that were not obviously supernatural, which in practice meant they stood outside looking like very tall, very pale security personnel. She had decided not to look too closely at the details. She was in her classroom at 7:30 in the evening, marking essays on Shelley, which was the kind of work she genuinely loved. When Corvain came through her window, he came through it without opening it, which was its own statement, and he was not alone. Two others arrived behind him with the speed that old vampires moved at, which was not quite visible as movement, and instead registered as sudden presence, and Marina was on her fuddy feet before she had consciously decided to stand. Her desk between her and them, and her hand on the window latch of the adjacent window, which she calculated was her fastest route to where she knew the guard was positioned. Corvain was a lean vampire with dark eyes and an expression of permanent mild disdain, and he looked at Marina the way she imagined he looked at most things that he considered temporary inconveniences. "The human teacher," he said, "will come with us quietly, or the declaration will be the least of Duke Dunraven's problems this evening." Marina's heart was hammering, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. She had decided months ago that the voice came first, and the heart rate was a separate matter entirely. "What exactly do you think you are going to accomplish? If you take me, Magnus will know within minutes. He will come." "That is the idea," Corvain said pleasantly. She understood then. This was not about her. This was about pulling Magnus out of the court, into an exposed position, away from his own ground and his own protections, to a confrontation that Valdric's people had had time to prepare. She was the bait in the trap, and Corvain had come to collect her. She glanced at the window latch, calculating. "Don't," Corvain said, reading the calculation. "I wasn't going to run," Marina said, which was not entirely true. She was going to run toward the guard rather than away, and she had already moved 2 steps in that direction, when the door of her classroom opened, and the first of Magnus's guard came through it fast and hard, and then the second, and then Magnus himself, and the room became very small very quickly. She had never seen Magnus in actual combat before. She had seen him manage court politics with the precision of someone who had been doing it for centuries. She had seen him angry in the way that powerful men who care are angry, controlled and cold and absolute. She had not seen this. It was over before she had processed that it had begun. Corvain and his 2 companions found themselves restrained in ways that she did not have the supernatural vocabulary to fully describe, and Magnus was standing in the center of her classroom, among the scattered essay papers and the half-drunk mug of cold tea and the projected image of her current presentation slide. And he was looking at her. "Are you hurt?" he said, and it was not a question in the way questions are usually questions. "I am fine," she said. "It is not a trap for me. It is a trap for you. Corvain is the bait now, and wherever Valdric wanted you to bring me is where they will be waiting." Magnus looked at Corvain with an expression that communicated the full weight of 900 years of consequence. "Speak," he said. "Where were you instructed to take her?" Corvain, to his credit, lasted approximately 15 seconds under that gaze before he told them everything. The location was a warehouse in the east of the city, one of 3 properties that the Ashencroft faction held above ground, and Valdric had assembled 12 members of allied houses with the intention of confronting Magnus in an exposed location and presenting him with a formal challenge to the dukedom on the grounds of unfitness to lead, specifically citing the declared intention to bond with a human consort as evidence of judgment compromised by personal attachment. "Judgment compromised by personal attachment," Marina repeated, when Magnus relayed this on the drive back to the court. "That is extraordinary, coming from a faction that just sent someone to abduct a schoolteacher." "Ashencroft operates on a logic that is internally consistent even when it is externally repugnant," Magnus said. He was seated beside her in the car, and despite the fact that everything was moving quickly, he looked precisely as composed as he always did, which she had once found unnerving and now found quietly steadying. "In his view, you represent a weakness." He has framed the challenge in terms that resonate with certain conservative elements of the court who share his discomfort with human involvement at this level. "Then we address the formal challenge," Marina said. "When and where?" 3 days' time. The challenge must be heard within the court, under the 12 Houses' oversight. It is a legal proceeding. He glanced at her. "You do not need to be present, Magnus." "I know," he said. "Then stop saying things that suggest I might not be." His mouth curved very slightly, which on Magnus was equivalent to a broad grin on anyone else. "You have a complete set of essays to finish marking. I am aware. I will do it before 3 days' time." She did finish them. She also spent a significant portion of the next 3 days in Magnus's library with his legal counsel. A vampire named Seraphine, who was small and several centuries old, and had the precise, relentless intelligence of someone who had been studying the same body of law for an enormous amount of time, and together they built the argument that Marina had been reaching toward since the night of the first tribunal. The human bonded consort provision, in its original 12th century Latin framing, had been established not to exclude, but to include. The Nocturne Court's founding documents reflected a moment when the vampire nobility had been significantly intertwined with human power structures, when the distinction between courts had been more porous, and the provision had been designed to allow precisely the kind of alliance that Valdric was now attempting to characterize as a weakness. Seraphine had found 3 historical precedents in the court records, 2 of which had been quietly obscured in later centuries by houses that found the precedent inconvenient. When Marina walked into the formal challenge hearing, she carried a bound legal brief that Seraphine had prepared and which Marina had read 3 times through to know it completely. She wore the same dark green dress, because she had decided it was what she wore to these proceedings, and she intended to make it a pattern. She sat at the formal respondents' table, beside Magnus and his counsel, and across from her, Valdric Ashencroft sat with his own team and the expression of a man who had been doing this for a very long time and believed he had seen every possible move. The hearing took 4 hours. Marina spoke twice, once to present the historical precedents, and once to answer a direct challenge from one of the Ashencroft-aligned House representatives, who suggested that a human's understanding of the succession law was necessarily limited by her lifespan. She answered that one by quoting directly from the original Latin codex from memory, which she had read sufficiently times that it had become available to her in that way, and the chamber went briefly and satisfyingly quiet. Magnus spoke for 40 minutes, and she listened to him with the particular attention she had always paid to language that was being used well, and what he said was this, in the formal register of court address, was the most precise and complete thing she had heard him say about any of this since they had met. He said that the court had been built on principles that predated the fearfulness that certain houses had cultivated in the intervening centuries. He said that the judgment to ally with strength and intelligence and integrity was not compromised judgment, but the precise judgment that a court required for survival. He said that the human teacher who sat at his table had walked into the most dangerous room in the court's jurisdiction without supernatural ability or immortal backing or any weapon except her own mind, and had found the flaw in Ashencroft's legal trap faster than any of Magnus's own counsel, and that if the court wished to discuss the question of whether that individual represented a weakness, he would be interested to hear the argument made specifically rather than generally. He said, near the end, quietly, and without any of the formal rhetorical structure of the preceding address, that the choice she had offered him was not the choice Ashencroft had attempted to construct. She had offered him something that the blood law and the succession crisis and the challenge procedure all missed entirely, which was the choice to do this with someone worth doing it with, and that was not a weakness the court could legislate away. The challenge was denied. The vote was 8-4, which meant that 4 of the 12 houses still sided with Ashencroft, but 8 was enough, and the legal threshold was met, and Valdric's formal challenge failed. In the corridor afterward, with the noise of the discussing court behind them, and Seraphine reviewing documents at the far end of the hall, with the focused energy of someone who had just won a legal argument and intended to document it thoroughly, Magnus stopped walking. Marina stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain. Not afraid for her, not calculating outcomes, not managing the room, simply uncertain, in the way that people are uncertain when they are about to say something true. "I should not have waited 6 months to tell you," he said. "No," she agreed. "I should also tell you now," he said, "that what I said in the chamber, the choice you offered me, I did not say that as a legal argument. I said it because it is what I believe." Marina looked at him in the amber light of the corridor. This ancient and extraordinary person who had spent 900 years learning caution and had spent the last 8 months forgetting it incrementally in the presence of someone who carried an ethics student's essay on Shelley in her bag and argued succession law from memory, and had never once asked him to be less than what he was. "I know," she said. "I have not said clearly," he said, and his voice was doing the thing it did when he was being precise about something that mattered. "That I love you. I should say it clearly." The words settled around her like something that had been waiting to arrive. "I love you," Marina said. "I have been loving you since approximately the 5th week, when you tried to explain to me why it was logically inconsistent to care about you, and you were so genuinely convinced by your own argument, and so completely wrong." He made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. Not the slight curve of the mouth or the dry inflection that constituted his usual register of amusement, but an actual laugh, brief and real and surprised. And it was one of the most beautiful things she had heard in her life. He kissed her in the corridor, with the formal challenge verdict still warm in the record books and Seraphine 40 feet away, and the amber light of the nocturne court falling across both of them. And the cold of him and the warmth of her were not opposites. They were a balance, and it felt like the end of something long and complicated, and the beginning of something she did not yet have the shape of. The 60 days moved differently than Marina had expected. She had anticipated that they would be consumed entirely by political maneuvering, and there was certainly political maneuvering, but there was also something else, which was the simple and radical experience of two people who loved each other deciding to be present in that fact without managing it at a distance. Magnus moved through her world more than he had before. He came to the school twice, because Blackthorn Academy's headmistress, who had been aware of the court's existence for 20 years through a very specific arrangement that Marina now understood had been deliberately maintained, was entirely untroubled by a vampire duke appearing in the staff car park to collect one of her teachers. He sat in Marina's flat and read while she marked papers, because he was constitutionally incapable of being in a room with books without reading them. And she found this unreasonably endearing. She moved through his world more deliberately, too. She attended 2 court functions and the harvest alignment, which was the court's most significant calendar event, and had nothing to do with agriculture, and everything to do with the annual renewal of the agreements between the Nocturne Court and the other supernatural entities that overlapped with its territory. She met Seraphine properly, not as counsel but as herself, and Seraphine was precisely as interesting outside of a legal context as she had suggested she would be. She met several others of Magnus's inner circle who had been cautious with her before and who became incrementally less cautious as the weeks passed, and she remained consistently herself. There were still those who were hostile. Valdric Ashencroft did not concede. The 4 dissenting houses were not converted by the challenge defeat. The line between those in the court who accepted Marina's presence and those who considered it an abomination moved very slowly, and Marina had been a teacher long enough to know that some opinions moved slowly and some moved not at all, and the correct response was to do the right thing anyway and let time do what it did. On the 42nd day, Seraphine presented her completed legal argument for the human bonded consort interpretation to a full court review, and it was accepted by a majority of the presiding tribunal. The ruling established, formally and binding in the Codex, that a human consort declared and publicly bound through the court record could fulfill the succession requirement without conversion, provided the bond was renewed voluntarily at intervals of the consort's natural generational span. A formulation that Seraphine had spent considerable ingenuity constructing so that it was both legally defensible and genuinely humane. Marina read the ruling 3 times before she said anything. "Renewed voluntarily," she said. "Yes. Seraphine said. The renewal is a formal reaffirmation, every generation, by the consort's choice. If at any renewal the consort or their descendants choose not to continue the bond, the succession line reverts to an internally appointed council structure. But the Duke's dukedom itself is not forfeit. She paused. It is as clean as the law allows. And the consort's descendants, Marina said. The ruling uses that word. How does that apply in this context, given that the law recognizes chosen familial structures in several of its elder provisions, Seraphine said, and there was something gentle in her ancient voice. The question of family is not resolved exclusively by bloodline in the oldest framings of the court's principles. It is resolved by bond. Marina thought about this for a long time. Sitting in the library with Seraphine's documents spread across the table, and the amber light moving through the stacked centuries of knowledge around her, she thought about the life she had lived before this, the flat with too many books, and the school with its paper deadlines, and the perfectly ordinary human shape of a future that she had assumed. She thought about what she was now building instead, which was something that had no template and no precedent she could point to comfortably and no guarantee, except for the fact that when she walked into a room and Magnus was in it, something settled in her that was always very slightly unsettled when he was not. She did not think she needed a template. She went to find him. He was in the map room, because Magnus was frequently in the map room when he had concerns to think through, surrounded by the cartographic record of 1,000 years of territorial arrangement and the kind of quiet that only very old spaces had. He was standing at the central table, looking at a current overlay, modern city map against the historical court boundaries, and he looked up when she came in. Seraphine's ruling passed, she said. I know, she sent word. He held her gaze. How do you feel about it? I think it is an elegant solution to a genuinely complicated problem, Marina said. And I think the person who deserves the most credit for it is Seraphine. Seraphine deserves considerable credit, he agreed. How do you feel about what it means? She crossed to the table and stood on the opposite side of it from him, with the maps between them and the amber light and the wait of 8 months and 8 months before that of 900 years she had not been part of but was now in some sense inheriting. It means I stay, she said. For as long as I have, I stay, and the staying is on record, and when I am gone, there is a structure that continues the intention of the bond without requiring me to be something I am not or for you to compromise what you believe. She paused. I think it is actually more honest than the alternative. It acknowledges the reality of what I am and what you are and the difference, and it builds something around that difference rather than trying to erase it. Magnus looked at her across the maps. It also means, she continued, because honesty in this direction was important, and she had decided to be thorough, that you will outlast me by an enormous margin, and that is not a small thing. And I want to say clearly that I have thought about it, and I am not avoiding the weight of it. And I think that if you have spent 9 centuries learning to carry loss, you are perhaps in a better position than either of us might prefer to carry this particular version of it, and that what we have now is worth the cost of later to me. He moved around the table. It was the only time she had seen him move quickly in an emotional context, crossing the room with the directness of someone who had stopped calculating the distance and simply closed it. And when he took her face in both hands and looked at her with those crimson eyes that had lived 900 years, and still managed to hold something that was not exhausted, she thought that this was exactly what love looked like when it was the right size for the people in it. The cost of later, he said quietly, is a debt I have been willing to carry since approximately the 5th week. When you told me my argument was logically inconsistent, and you were so immediately and completely correct. She laughed, startled, and he kissed her, and the maps of 1,000 years of court territory lay between the amber light and the stone walls, and the 60 days were almost done, and the world outside was vast and complicated, and full of things that would require managing. But the room was very quiet, and they were in it together. The binding ceremony was held on the 58th day, 2 days before the succession window closed. Because Seraphine had pointed out that the legal requirement was met at the moment of binding under the new ruling's interpretation, and there was no reason to wait until the last possible moment. And Marina had agreed, because she was a teacher and she had a professional orientation toward not leaving things to the last moment. The ceremony was held in the great hall of the Dunraven court, and it was not private. Magnus had made that decision, and Marina had understood it immediately, understood that making it private would have been a concession to the factions that considered it something to be hidden, and making it witnessed by the full court was the statement that it was not hidden and would not be. The hall was extraordinary. She had seen it before in other contexts, but not prepared for ceremony. And prepared for ceremony, it was something out of a dream she might have had about what history felt like. From the inside, the black stone walls hung with the banners of every house in attendance, the amber light from 1,000 candles, the assembled court in formal dress that ranged across centuries of fashion that each individual had simply stopped updating at some point and made their own, all of it old and alive and immense. Magnus stood at the center of the hall in the most formal version of his ducal attire, which involved a greatcoat in deep charcoal that reached the floor and the formal marks of his house at the collar and cuffs. And his silver-white hair was swept back with the precise severity of someone who took ceremonial formality seriously, and he was watching her walk down the center of the hall, with an expression that she had only seen a handful of times but would recognize now in any light. Seraphine performed the ceremony in the formal Latin of the Codex, and the words were old and beautiful, and Marina understood them, because she had read them enough times that they had become hers, and she responded to them in the same register, her voice clear in the enormous space. Magnus spoke the reciprocal vows in a voice that did not waver, that carried the full weight of what he meant by every word, and Marina thought that this was possibly the most efficient communication she had ever witnessed from someone who generally required considerable conversation to arrive at direct statement. They exchanged the formal tokens of the bonded consort tradition, his a ring set with a stone that he told her afterward was a garnet taken from the founding collection of the court, hers a ring she had chosen that was simple and dark and fit precisely. When Seraphine spoke the concluding words and the assembly bore witness, Marina felt the shift in the room that was not supernatural. It was simply the shift that happens when something important is made real in front of the people it is real for. Valdric Ashencroft was present. He was legally required to be, as with the declaration, and his expression was controlled in a way that communicated significant internal activity. He did not speak during the ceremony. He did not contest the ruling it was founded on. He looked at Marina as she processed back down the hall beside Magnus, and his expression was not warm, but it was not what it had been in the first chamber. It was something older and more complicated. The expression of someone who was in the process of updating his position. He bowed. It was a minimal bow, barely a degree of inclination, but it was present and it was real. And Marina nodded back to him with the particular calm she had learned to maintain in rooms where the politics were complicated. And that was sufficient for now. After the ceremony, the court held the traditional first acknowledgement reception, which was the gathered houses, taking turns to formally acknowledge the bonded consort before the court record. Magnus stood at her side throughout, his hand warm at her back in a way that communicated precisely nothing about protocol and everything about presence, and she accepted acknowledgement after acknowledgement from beings who had lived longer than her entire civilization, with the composure she had built over 8 months, and the quiet certainty that she knew where she stood. Seraphine was the last in the formal line, and she acknowledged Marina with words that were not the traditional formula, and were instead something personal and precise and warm, and Marina thanked her with an equal precision and made a mental note to find out what Seraphine actually liked to talk about when she was not in a legal context. Later, very much later. When the hall had cleared, and the candles had been allowed to burn low, and the court had withdrawn to give them the ceremonial private hour that was traditional, Marina and Magnus stood by the great window that looked from beneath the city up through the specialized glass to the light-contaminated London sky above. "There are 4 houses that are still opposed," Marina said. "Yes," Magnus said. "There will be work to do on that over time. Is Valdric's bow a tactical concession or a genuine revision? Both, probably. He is not a simple person." Magnus looked at the sky. "He will move carefully now." The ruling has been incorporated into the codex. The challenge failed. He is not without options, but he is without the legal ground he was attempting to use. He will need to find a different approach to his ambitions. We should watch the second house liaison appointments, Marina said. Corvain will be replaced, and whoever replaces him will be worth knowing about. Magnus turned from the window and looked at her with that expression she had not had a name for, and now did. The expression of someone looking at something that resolves a particular kind of ache by its presence. You are going to be extraordinary at this, he said. I have been managing rooms full of people who would rather be somewhere else and guiding them toward conclusions they did not know they were capable of for 6 years, Marina said. Court politics are not incomparable. Considerably more lethal, he said. I have considered that, and I have a very protective vampire duke on my side, she said, which adjusts the risk assessment somewhat. He moved to her with that directness that had become her favorite version of him, the version that did not calculate the distance, and she leaned against him with the ease of someone who had learned the specific geography of another person, and found it wholly home. His arms around her were cool and absolute and steady in the way that things are steady when they have been present for a very long time. I need to tell you something, he said. Tell me. I went back to the alley. Several weeks after the first night, before you knew I had recognized where the school was, I went back because I could not determine, rationally, why that particular moment had registered the way it did, and I thought returning to the location would provide some clarity. Marina raised her head to look at him. Did it? No, he said. It provided no clarity at all. It only confirmed that whatever had happened was not location-dependent, and was therefore not going to be resolved by analysis. When did you give up on analysis? Approximately week 9, he said. When you told me that the reason vampire courts throughout history had struggled with succession was that they had modeled inheritance on human bloodline systems that had their own significant problems, and that a court structured on chosen bonds rather than biological ones might actually be more stable over an immortal timeframe, and you said it so casually, as though the thought had simply occurred to you, and I realized you had just proposed a structural reform to a system I had been inside for 9 centuries and found what was wrong with it in an evening. He paused. At that point, analysis seemed insufficient. Marina laughed, genuinely laughed, and felt his chest move with his own quiet laughter beneath her cheek, and the amber light of the ancient court moved around them, and the London sky was a smear of reflected light above the deep stone, and everything was not resolved. The 4 dissenting houses were real, the ongoing politics of the Nocturne Court were real, the complicated and extraordinary future they were building was uncharted and would require constant attention, but none of that touched the moment they were in. In the weeks following the ceremony, the court began to change in the way that things change when a decision has been made and held to, slowly and not in a straight line, but with a cumulative direction. 2 of the 4 dissenting houses sent formal acknowledgements belatedly that Marina understood were not warm endorsements but were functional concessions, and she accepted them with the same measured courtesy she had offered Valdric's bow. The 3rd house was neutral and likely to remain so for some time. The 4th was committed to Ashencroft and would remain so, and that was a fact to work with, rather than a problem to solve. Immediately, Seraphine's ruling on the human bonded consort provision generated a correspondence from 3 other Nocturne courts in other cities, all of whom had their own version of the succession problem, and were watching the London court's resolution with considerable interest. Magnus handled the correspondence with his characteristic precision, and Marina sat in on 2 of the response sessions and offered several observations that Magnus incorporated, and she found that the experience of seeing how vampire court diplomacy operated at an interterritorial level was genuinely fascinating in the way that very complex systems were always fascinating, which was to say, endlessly. She continued teaching. She had thought about this quite a lot and concluded that the work of it was not incompatible with her expanded life, but actually supported it. Because the thing she had always valued about teaching was the conviction that the way people understood things mattered, and that clear, honest, well-constructed thinking was worth building in whoever you had the chance to build it in, And that conviction did not diminish in this context of a vampire court politics, but rather became more urgent. She was also aware that her students were young humans who would grow up in a world with the court in it, whether they knew about it or not, and that the things she could teach them about ethics and literature and the way that power operated in stories was not separate from the world they were actually in. Magnus came to the school's end-of-year faculty event. He stood by the refreshment table and talked to the headmistress for 40 minutes about Victorian architecture, which she later described as one of the most informed conversations she had had in years, and he was introduced to two of Marina's colleagues as her husband, which was a word that made something quiet and very settled happen in Marina's chest, and which Magnus used with a naturalness that suggested he had been using it internally for some time. Corvain was replaced as third house liaison by a vampire named Elsinara, who was subtle and watchful and arrived at her first court session, having clearly researched Marina's background comprehensively. Marina met her gaze directly across the council table, and Elsinara held it for a long moment and then looked away first, and Marina catalogued this as a potential ally in approximately 6 months if the right conversations happened. Valdric Ashencroft attended his required court functions and was correct in every formal particular and entirely contained in his opposition, which was in the language of vampire court politics, its own form of long game. Marina tracked his movements in the way that she tracked any student who was quiet in class and highly intelligent, which was to say with attention and without anxiety. In the autumn, something happened that she had not anticipated. One of the border incursions that the Dunraven Court's protection agreement covered, a minor territorial intrusion by an entity that the court's records classified in ways she did not yet have the vocabulary for, resolved in a manner that required Magnus to be in the field for 3 days, away from the court, and Marina managed 2 scheduled court communications in his absence with Seraphine's assistance and her own preparation. When he returned, she briefed him on both conversations with the precision she brought to all reporting, and he listened to the entire briefing without interrupting, and at the end he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You told the Eastern Court's representative that our position on the territorial margin was not negotiable because the agreement of 1847 established it as a fixed boundary, not a flexible one." "It does establish it that way," Marina said. "I verified with Seraphine before the call." "He has been attempting to renegotiate that margin for 40 years, Magnus said. "He will not attempt it again. I assumed that was likely his intent, yes." Magnus looked at her with an expression that she had come to understand was his version of being profoundly moved, contained and present, and directed entirely at her. "What do you need?" he asked, which was a question he had started asking her a few months in and which she had taken some time to stop deflecting. "Tea," she said. "And for you to tell me about the border situation, because I want to understand the full context of the court's territorial arrangements, and there are gaps in what the documents cover." He made her tea, which he had learned to do correctly, and they sat together in the library for 2 hours, while he explained and she listened and asked questions, and he answered them with the completeness she had come to rely on, and outside the court the city moved through its autumn. And inside the ancient carved spaces beneath the stone, and the light-contaminated hull sky, and the deep amber glow of centuries, they built the life they had chosen, out of trust and honesty, and the kind of lined love that does not require its object to be less complicated than they are. The winter brought the solstice court, the largest gathering of the nocturne courts from the surrounding region, held in rotation among the major courts and falling to London this cycle. Magnus prepared for it with the thoroughness that he brought to everything significant, and Marina prepared alongside him with the thoroughness that she brought to everything she had decided to understand. Seraphine provided a detailed briefing document on every representative who would attend. Marina read it twice through and then asked Seraphine 3 questions that Seraphine answered, and then looked at her with a particular expression. "You are going to be very good at this," Seraphine said, which was what Magnus had said, and which Marina had heard from enough angles by this point to have stopped deflecting. "I have good teachers," Marina said. The solstice court convened in the great hall at midwinter. 70 representatives from 11 courts, and Marina Dunraven, bonded consort of the Duke of the Nocturne Court, stood at her husband's side at the head of that hall. In a gown of deep green that Seraphine had said was traditional for a consort's first solstice, and which Marina had accepted because she had learned to pick her battles, and this was not one of them. And she looked out at the assembled immortal courts of Northern Europe, and she thought about the alley behind the school, and the moment when a very old and very powerful being had looked at her and decided she was worth talking to. She thought about the blood law and the forced choice and the trap that had been built to constrain both of them, and how the answer to it had not been either of the options that they had been offered, but a third option that required believing the problem could be thought through differently. She thought about Isadora, whom she had never met and whom she honored by the fact that Magnus had trusted her with the story, and she thought about the grief that an immortal carried and how it did not prevent love but made it something different, more considered and more deliberate, and chosen with the full knowledge of what choosing costs. She looked at Magnus beside her, silver-white and crimson-eyed and 900 years deep, and he looked at her, and what passed between them in that look was everything they had built and everything they intended to build still, the disagreements and the political complications and the opposing houses and the long work of it. And underneath all of that, the simple and enormous fact of having found in the world precisely the person who made the world more worth being in. He offered her his arm with the formal courtesy of the court, and she took it with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she stood. And together they walked forward into the solstice court, into the long and complicated and luminous future that had started in an alley behind a school on an ordinary evening, when a human teacher had looked at something extraordinary and decided it was worth knowing.